All right, so here we go. This is going to be part 7 of me reading P3, and I've kind of gotten a bunch of DMs about, talk a little bit more about New England skateboarding in the, early 80s and mid 80s, and um, yeah. So before we get into the reading of this, someone was actually asking me like how many ramps were there back then? And when I first started skating, as I said in the book, in Paxton there was Tom Putnam's ramp, Twista's ramp, and that was like one of the best ramps on the East Coast at that time. I think Johnny Cardash, Johnny Carwash had a ramp in New Hampshire. I never actually skated it. There was a few here and there. I think as you kind of headed more towards 1986, 87, there was more ramps that kind of popped up. Sean McLean had a ramp that was down in Braintree. We actually went down and skated that one day. I think there was an article in Thrasher, like Sean McLean's ramp jam or something. I think he axle stalled off the roof of his garage and rolled into the ramp or something like that. It's in one of those issues from Thrasher from like probably 1985. So there was his ramp. Of course, there was the Chelmsford ramp. That was the one that I kind of talked about Mark Conahan smashing his trucks on. And then there was the ramp that was in Newton. There was a ramp in Newton, Mass, but I think Newton and Chelmsford were the same ramp. I think the ramp that was in Newton got moved to Chelmsford at one point. And then there was the Canton ramp, and the ramp in Canton was like, that was the epitome of awesome for a while. And then, kind of intersprinkled in that time period too, there was actually Jay Lambert's ramp in Holden. I said his name was Mike Lambert the other day. I don't know why I said Mike Lambert, but there was Jay Lambert's ramp that was in Holden. There was John Weston's ramp that was also in Holden. That was kind of down the street. Lambert's ramp in the beginning was kind of like a really small vert ramp. And then Weston's was kind of like the bigger vert ramp. So I think it was 16 feet wide, had pool coping. It was maybe like 8.5 foot trannies, probably 8 foot trannies, which was pretty true about that time. But Weston's ramp had really big decks on it. And then kind of towards the later, like 1986, there was Mike Emond had his 10-foot transition ramp that was in Holden as well. So there was kind of a lot of ramps, and there was also like, you go down to Rhode Island, and there was the Blues, which was a ramp that was really, really wide for that time. I think it was like 24 feet wide, maybe even wider than that, 28 feet wide. And it had fiberglass transitions with wood flat bottom. And that was like all the Rhode Island guys at that time would skate there. They'd occasionally come up and skate in Holden, and then we would see, their crew at the ramp in Canton. There was a lot of traveling at that point, and you had our crew from like Worcester and Holden, and then you had the crew from like, Boston, which was, at that point, it was like Kevin Day, Frank Lannon, Alien, Jeff the Alien, and then like Jim Noonan, Jeff Thompson, Johnny Cardash, God, who else? Rob Murphy, Twista, Fred Smith, Metal Man. Like there was Bruce Juice. There was all these dudes that were like, they were kind of like the older generation, and they were all just like super rippers at that point. And then we were kind of the young and up and coming crew, like myself and Eric Dara, Mike McDonald, Lexi Garrick, Jay Blunt. Who else was there in that little crew? Like I said, like Jay Lambert, Matt Jones, myself, Rob Levine, Jeff Simons, Roundy. Like we were the crew that would do a lot of like the traveling. We would go to Boston, or we would go to, some of these outlying ramps, like the Canton ramp or Chelmsford, and meet up with the dudes from Boston. That was the scene. There was a ton of traveling back then on the East Coast, just because there wasn't that many ramps. And, it seemed like, you know, everything was really spread out. But as far as like the community of skaters, you have to remember this is a time when there's no cell phone. So it's like, you know, I get like Dan Estabrook from Boston's number, and he writes it down on a crumpled up piece of paper, and I put it in my pocket, and I call them, and then sometimes they would take the bus from Boston up to Worcester and come skate with us and skate, you know, like where the Full Pipe was in Auburn, Mass, or like the Auburn Banks, and then we would go down there and we would skate City Hospital, or we would go to, you know, the Metals Banks in Boston, or, you know, any number of different spots. And this, I think it was a really interesting time, you know, just as far as like, you know, having it parallel what happened in snowboarding too, because at that point it was really like you had to travel a lot for snowboarding too on the East Coast. And it's going to be, there's a documentary coming out called Streets and Sidewalks that's kind of talks about the old East Coast vert scene and skateboard scene, just how it came up from like, you know, from like the Loud Ones crew up through, you know, all the insanely good street skaters, Robbie Gengemi, and like, you know, PJ Ladd, and all these insane dudes that came out of Boston, you know, to where it is now. I mean, we had a really, as much as it, you know, for a while it seemed like there was nothing to skate, and then all of a sudden there was like this explosion of ramps everywhere. I mean, like, shit, one of the best ramps I had ever skated in my life was Paul Savini's ramp in Cotuit, Mass, on the Cape, and it was a 24-foot wide steel vert ramp, and that was, you know, probably 89, 90 maybe. That was right after I got done with school. I went and lived on the Cape at my grandma's house, and I would skate that every day. And it was, you know, going from not having a lot of vert ramps to having like Paul's ramp, and then all of a sudden ZT Maximus opens up in Boston, and then Zero Gravity opens up in Nashua, New Hampshire. Then after that, Rats opens up in Maine, and then the Skate Hut opens up in Rhode Island. Like, the scene just exploded right then in like the late 80s, early 90s. And you know, to this day, it's like East Coast skate scene is like, it's nothing like anywhere else, you know, because we had to deal with the elements. And I think I have a quote in that Streets and Sidewalks movie coming out that it's like, you know, skating started in California, but it really, you know, it got its backbone on the East Coast. And I think that's true because, you know, we were shoveling off ramps and burning ice off the flat bottom, and, you know, basically just making do with what we had. And there was just, you know, there was days when the snowbanks were piled high next to the flat bottom. And no, unless you grew up back east or in a climate where it snows and you have an outdoor ramp, like, you'll never know that. And it sucked, you know. I mean, there was a long time when I looked at the snow forecast and I was super bummed because it just meant that, you know, shit, we can't skate before snowboarding. And it's ironic that, you know, now it's like if the forecast has got 4 days of sun, you're kind of like, ugh, you know. So anyway, so there's a little more East Coast skateboard talk. I get more into it in here as well. So yeah, so here we go, picking up. All expenses not paid. I'd flown in an airplane only once before to Florida when I was 7. So the trip to Tahoe, all the way across the country, was huge. I won't remember, this is with me and Chris Swires are going out to the Vision Pro in the snow at Squaw Valley. My parents were very adept at planning for everything that could go wrong. Kiss, kiss, call me when you get there, said my mom. Chris Swires and I landed in Reno, the closest airport to California Tahoe Mountain Resorts, and met Mickey Keller, our new team manager, and most of the Sims team in the baggage area. I was 20, but I felt like a 3-year-old in front of Mickey Mouse at Disneyland. Tucker Friends and Terry Kidwell, Kevin Delaney, Chris Jameson at that point. JMO was being courted by Sims before he went and became like a Mervyn dude for the rest of his life. They were all there, just hanging out, waiting for their bags, just like us. Swires and I hung back and whispered to each other, dude, look at all these pros. Then Swires' older brother Greg, who worked at Heavenly, another resort in Tahoe, showed up, and we waved goodbye to the guys. We waved goodbye to the guys we really wanted to hang with. We'd come 4 days before the event with the understanding that we'd couch surf at Swires' brother's place for a couple days until our hotel room with the team was available. But it appeared as though he was our chaperone when he picked us up, and I felt kind of stupid. That didn't last very long though, because I was in California. Actually, I was in Nevada, But in my mind, I was already in California, all the way to Heavenly. I couldn't stop saying, I can't believe we're in California. I'd never been to California before, and one of my biggest life goals at that point, just because of skating and everything I saw in the magazines, was actually to get to California. So it's really hard to articulate to someone who maybe lives in California, who has, been able to travel their whole lives. But for me, getting to California was it really was like going to Disneyland. Like, just, I was in California. Like, holy shit, this is California. And it was so mythical to me at that point in life. The next morning, we headed into a whole new world. It snowed 2 feet the night before, the biggest dump that I'd ever seen. The Sierra Mountains could have been the Himalayas as far as I was concerned. I couldn't believe that people actually snowboarded this type of terrain. The expert runs were so steep that if you fell, you'd roll all the way to the bottom of the mountain. And they didn't have cheesy East Coast names like White Heat or the Corn Cobber or Devil's Crotch. There were huge cliffs that people were jumping off of, and the runs were really long. And this is at Heavenly too, so talk about going from like Mount Wachusett or Killington in New England to Heavenly with a full view of Lake Tahoe with a whole bunch of fresh pie. It was like the dreamiest of dreamy scenarios. I couldn't ride top to bottom without stopping to rest my legs and my lungs. It was the complete opposite of the gentle rolling hills I was accustomed to back home. Heavenly was Sean Palmer's zone. That day, Swires and I were wearing our magic purple jumpsuits, hoping he'd recognize us fellow Sims team riders. Sure enough, Palmer came up to us in the lift line, wearing some older Sims gear that was torn up and held together with duct tape. It was. Palmer was wearing just some random shit. It was actually so fucking punk rock back then. I took a deep breath and tried to be cool, casually sticking my chest out to display the embroidered Sims logo. Did I though? Hey, what's up? He said, looking at Swires. Didn't I hook up with your sister at the Open? That is 100% true. He talked to us for a minute and then said, see you later, and got on the chairlift. Swires knew about the hookup with his sister and couldn't have cared less. What he cared about, like me, was that Sean Palmer had talked to us in public. It was the coolest thing in the world. Palmer was kind of a jerk, but he was cool at the same time. I respected the shit out of him. And I respected him even more after riding Heavenly. It took us a while to get used to riding in Deep Pow, but after that, we started following some other locals around the mountain. Actually, I had met that day, we rode with Christy Elder, and I think it may have been Jimmy Halapoff at that time too. And yeah, we just met these people randomly on the hill. They rode in the trees at speed. I thought they were fast and open runs, and there was times that I was intimidated by the bigness of it all. It was humbling and at the same time very inspiring. 2 days later, we jumped on a bus to Squaw Valley. The resort hadn't always been receptive to snowboarding. According to legend, in 1988, the president of Squaw Valley wrote a letter to ISM that said, "We do not believe that snowboarding is truly compatible with regular alpine skiing for several reasons, not the least of which is safety. Lack of releasable bindings, loading and unloading lifts, and acrobatics, just to name a few." The following summer, pro snowboarder Tom Burt ran into Squaw's president on a beach in Mexico and introduced himself. Tom Burt taught him how to surf, and Squaw Valley changed its policy the following winter. That is fully inserted in here by Eric Blem. I don't know if that's like a real story or not, so if anyone that knows Tom Burt, please ask him, because I would love to know that. Swires and I met Mickey at the Squaw Valley Inn. It's actually what Plumpjack is now. That's where we stayed. And we went up to the counter, register, figuring it would have to pay despite the original deal. To our surprise and relief, Mickey had a room reserved for us, which we thought was great because we weren't on the A team, which got paid and had its expenses covered, or a B team, which I think got free gear and expenses covered. We were on the super secret East Coast C team. There was A team, B team, and C team at that point, and we were for sure on the C team. I think Swires and I were Sims' East Coast experiment to see if freestyle was really alive east of the Mississippi. So at this point in time, Chris Swires, myself, Lisa Vinciguerra, who Lisa went on to marry my good friend Rob Levine, who introduced me to snowboarding, but Lisa was on like the A team at that point. Like they were like, holy shit, she's really good. A team. And then also Mark Sullivan from the Snowboard Project was also on the Sims team. So anyway, yeah, we were on the C team, and anything we got above and beyond free gear was gravy. After Mickey handed us our room keys, she held up the just-released 1990 International Snowboard magazine and said, "Have you seen this?" The cover featured Tom Burt busting through a wall of trees straight towards the camera. He was wearing a flaming pastel orange and yellow tie-dye jacket, blue gloves, and neon pink belay goggles. This was totally acceptable back then. It was for fashion. In fact, brands encouraged mixing pastels, primaries, and neons. "Check page 37, full page, full color," Mickey said, and I flipped open to a Trevor Graves shot of me doing an East Coast double-handed rocket air at Stratton's Pipe, taken right after the US Open. I was stoked until I closed the mag, and on the back cover was a Sims ad featuring Chris Roach pulling a full West Coast Chris Miller style inspired frontside nosebone with his hand tight next to his foot. I flipped back and forth from his shot to my shot, and it was like night and day. So here we go. This is it right there. This is the shot that I got in that ISM mag, and there is Roach on the back cover. So you can see like where things were really, really different back then as far as like what freestyle was going on. Roach really inspired what modern, the way that people grab and do things today. And that's another picture. That's Ken Achenbach shot that one of me at Copper Mountain later that year. We'll get to that. Roach was on point with his skate style grab so close to his binding. I figured I had to get my shit together. That night, to our surprise, Swires and I were actually invited to the A-Team meeting, which took place in Mickey's hotel room. We had no idea what went on in a snowboard meeting, but it sounded pretty important. It ended up being a casual discussion about how the boards were riding, who would be featured in the next ads, and a bunch of mutual heckling and chest pounding. Swires and I kept our mouths shut and stayed in the shadows until Mickey made a phone call to Brad Stewart, who had been promoted to marketing director of the brand. And the phone was passed around from pro to pro, to me. "Hey Todd, how's it going? Glad you're there, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "This guy knows I'm here? What do you need?" he asked. I said, "A new half-pipe freestyle board and maybe a Kidwell," I said tentatively, because they were, basically what it was is Brad was on the, I think it was on, I don't even know if he was on speakerphone, if there was even speakerphone back then. But anyways, it was like, Brad was coming to the event the next day, and he was kind of asking everyone what they needed. And just passing the phone around. And this is at a time when Tim Wendell and Tucker and Delaney and all these dudes were so integral about how bindings were set up. And at this point, I think Wendell had custom stances, and a lot of the boards were coming from the factory they weren't drilled. So these guys were putting helicoils in them, which is basically the female part of where your bolt goes in, but they were hand putting them in boards. And so there was a lot of rad people in this meeting. It was just for instance, Scott Downey, Tucker, myself. I'm not sure if Roach was actually there. He probably went back down to Grass Valley, but I'll get more into this because this whole trip to Tahoe was flipping crazy, and yeah, it kind of blew my mind. Brad said, "Do you need any shirts or anything?" I was tempted, but the C team had a policy that if you got new gear, you had to turn in your old stuff to the factory. True. I liked how my Kidwell worked. It was nice and broken in, soft like a banana. I didn't want to give it up. The Red Vision, the distributor for Sims, sweatshirt I've been wearing in all my published snowboarding photos thus far was lucky, and I didn't really want to part with it for superstitious reasons, so I told him I was all good. On the way back to our room, I asked Swires what he ordered. He'd spent a lot of time with Jeff Brushy, who had been coached by Andy Coughlin, and a long line of in-the-know scam artists. He said, "I ordered 4 boards, some boots, sweatshirts, new gloves, half a dozen t-shirts." And then I said, damn, I blew it. Sweeze knew what was up, because Andy was always like, you got to milk him. And he milked him. My first and last police lineup. We went to Mi Casa, a Mexican restaurant in Tahoe City, with the Sims team that night. Sean Palmer, Scott Upside Downey, Kevin Delaney, Tim Wendell, Chris Jameson, Lisa Vinciguerra, Paul Parsons, Bill Harris, Terry Kidwell, Tucker Franzen, and Mark Gator Rogowski, and Matt Cummins. We all went to dinner at this Mexican restaurant and Chris Bradshaw. Chris Bradshaw was this random pro from Arizona who knew Brad Stewart from Arizona Snow Bowl. I think he was, yeah, at any rate, here we go. Matt Cummins was there representing LibTech, a new company born on the West Coast. It was a who's who of all the heroes in video games and magazines. To be part of the Sims team was incredible. This meal was such a milestone in my life, it's still like a photograph in my mind. Yeah, and the fact that Gator was there, this is pre-murdering a girl, putting her in a surfboard bag and burying her in the desert. This is when he was still like, you know, the shit. I sat between Gator and a guy named John Bradshaw, who was a close friend of Brad Stewart and Kevin Stobbs. I'd never heard of him, but I'll never forget him. He was the king of doing weird things like folding a napkin into a dick or a dragon or this weird little crying baby thing, all of which made me shoot food out of my nose. People were getting hammered. I was still too young and I wasn't really into partying anyway. So these guys were going nuts on sponsored beer and margaritas, and all I wanted to do was talk to Gator about skateboarding. Finally, he brought up skateboarding and I blurted out, "Dude, I skate, I'm a skater." That opened up the conversation. We talked about photos and recent skate mags. I rambled on about Fred Smith, the Canton Ramp, Maximus, Todd Squad, tricks that be crossed over to snowboarding, blah, 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 blah. I probably talked his ear off. But I got the impression he was stoked that I was the youngest looking guy at the table, but I could talk to him about skateboard related trivia. Actually, I don't think that. I think Gator was probably so hammered at that point that he was just like, you know, being nice. At the end of the night, I shook his hand and it felt like we were bros. Swires and I both felt accepted, despite the fact that during dinner, Jameson had ripped on us both relentlessly, ordering us milk because we were underage and shit like that. We ate it up. After dinner, most of the pros headed to the hotel bar or the hot tub or wherever post-21 superheroes go, but Swires and I went to bed that night so we could get up early and be rested to ride. We were woken up at 6:30 the next morning by Mickey pounding on our room door. She was going down the hallway to each of the riders' rooms yelling, "Everybody outside in the parking lot, we have a problem." Outside, 2 cop cars were parked alongside an impromptu police lineup of the Sims team, minus Gator and Matt Cummins. What the hell is going on, I thought to myself as a cop ushered me and Swires to the end of the line. So this is like the back of the Plump Jack at Squaw. We're all lined up. The whole Sims team is lined up against the wall. Some guy with a bandage on his head got out of the police car and walked up and down the line, glaring suspiciously at each of us. The guy huddled with the cops for a few tense minutes, and then we were released to go about our business. Inside the lobby, Tucker filled us in. Something gnarly went down in the hot tub last night. They thought it was one of us. Then he whispered, "We think it was Gator." He got in an argument with the dude and whacked him in the head with a bottle. The guy woke up on the edge of the spa, and all he could remember was a couple of derelict snowboarders who'd been talking shit to him. Swires and I were wide-eyed. I had a pretty sheltered existence to that point, and this was real serious. It kind of bummed me out. It hit me much harder the following winter when Gator raped and murdered a 21-year-old girl, the best friend of his estranged girlfriend, and stuffed her body into a surfboard bag and buried her in the California desert. It's so fucked up. He's now serving a life sentence. When I heard this news, I flashed back to that night at Mikasa, how stoked Gator had been while talking about skateboarding. How could that same guy commit such a horrible crime? The whole thing really creeped me out. It kind of gave me some insight into a life that I could have lived without. This whole snowboarding, skateboarding fantasy wasn't supposed to include the evils of the real world. Unfortunately, I learned that there's no escaping reality. So, if anyone knows Matt Cummins, ask Matt Cummins about this, because Matt was there that night, and I think Matt witnessed this go down. I think I actually talked to Matt about this after the fact, but yeah, freaking crazy. Fucking Gator. Riding with legends. After the lineup, we packed into a van to Donner Summit for slalom practice because back then, most sponsored riders didn't just do one event. Sims wanted well-rounded riders and overall results. Considering that 95% of the Sims team were freestyle snowboarders, it was pretty pointless. But at the time, there were no half-pipe specialists, which was exactly how I thought of myself. Even Palmer, one of the top freestyle pipe riders in the world, ripped at racing. So did Roach, and so did Kidwell at that point. And Kidwell had been known to take a top 5 in the gates as well. I flailed my way through practice, taking some of the gates to the dome, getting whacked in the head by the poles. And when we finally and when we were finally excused, I felt like a kid at recess. So this is at Donner. This is the first time I'd ever ridden Donner Ski Ranch too, obviously. Chris Roach and his brother Monty, Tucker Franzen, and this other Tahoe local named Devin Ryerson. Hi, Devin. I surf with Devin every single day here, which is pretty funny, in Encinitas, that we met there at Donner during this thing. We took off towards Donner's little excuse for a half pipe with Swires and me hot on their tails. This session was just for fun, but I still felt pressure to perform and hopefully salvage some of my dignity after my horrible slalom racing performance. It had been a year since we'd seen these guys snowboard in person, but we'd been studying their riding in a snowboard movie called The Western Front. I highly advise you to see The Western Front if you've never seen it. Fall Line Films' first movie. It's incredible. It was the first snowboard video that I ever bought. It was produced by Fall Line Films, but specialized in freestyle snowboarding shot in Tahoe. I watched it a million times. Seriously, I wore that tape out. The guys had longer bleach blonde hair, updated Sims clothes, and cool sticker jobs on their boards. They all had Tahoe style, not only in their riding, but their look. They were everything that we wanted to be, but just didn't know enough about. It was hard to ride and watch them at the same time. They were pulling unbelievable like shit, like fakie 360s, taking off backwards and landing backwards, and just riding switch. They were doing switch indies, which at that point, I believe they were calling them rewinds, which was pretty rad. Basically just like, I think Rankwit made that up but I think, it's like a rewind grind. It's like a fakie frontside 5-0 to fakie. And I think, Rankwit grew up skating vert too. So he just started calling anything that was like fakie to fakie or rewind air instead of like a switch, whatever. The pipe was essentially a crappy ditch with chopped up snow and big frozen snow boulders pushed off to one side. If you hit a snow boulder the right way, it could pop you into the middle of the half pipe. It sounds funny now, but half pipes were really dangerous back then. Most of the hits would send you into the adjacent trees if you weren't careful. Kidwell showed up and started hitting the same spot everyone else was. Tucker was doing frontside inverts off of it, and I was like, what? If someone can do frontside inverts on a snowboard, that is crazy. The only time I'd ever seen someone do one like as clean like that was Bert Lamar in a photo. The entrance to the pipe was just this meager snowbank, but I could snap up into an invert on anything, a mogul, even flat ground if there was a tiny bump. I waited for a gap in the action, dropped in, and snapped up into an andrecht on that little wall, installed the living shit out of it, and then casually laid it back down. I looked around and noticed that Tucker and Kidwell were staring at me. Kidwell said, dude, that's messed up. Tucker followed with like, how did you do that? There's actually nothing there. Nothing compares to that moment in the shitty Donner pipe when Kidwell and the Tahoe crew paid me a compliment for my riding. Nothing. Holy frickin' half pipe. The next day, January 23rd, 1990, was half pipe practice at Squaw. And this was the Vision Pro and the snow pipe was right at the base of Mainline Pocket, I believe. If that's the right place. It's kind of like, it's actually right, if you go to Squaw now, it's where the bigger park is at Squaw Valley. It's right where that triple line is of jumps. That's right where the pipe was. When I took a look at that pipe, all I could think was, damn, it's big. The Squaw pipe was an actual pipe with transitions. It had probably 8-foot walls that were difficult to get used to after all the crappy pipes I'd ridden on the East Coast. Not to mention the little ditch at Donner. Here, you had to make your own line because there weren't really highway ruts guiding you in from hit to hit. Plus, it was really steep, so Swires and I were legitimately intimidated. What freaked me out the most was riding with Damian Sanders. Damian was a hard-booted, bleach-blonde, neon spandex-wearing psycho who rode for Avalanche snowboards. He went bigger than anybody else. He would tuck the entire half-pipe, build speed, and just do one huge air. Like a contorted, ultra-tweaked-out cross rocket that made him look double-jointed. Or a big progressive 360, grabbing on his tip on the first 180 and on his tail the second 180, while 10 feet above the lip, easy. It was like going to Twista's ramp all over again. A pipe just crawling with talent, and I was out of my league. Burton had sent a salvo team from the East Coast, known as the Burton Army. Also, who was there was Jeff Davis, Mike Jacoby, Jimmy Scott, he was a vertical roller skater turned snowboarder, Jason Ford, and Noah Brandon. We were all sessioning. and we were with our West Coast dominated squad of Sims team riders. Other big names like Don Zabo and Victor Coyne, they rode for Nectar Snowboards, Dan Donnelly from K2, Andy Hetzel representing Kemper, Brian Harper riding for Look, Mike Estes and John Boyer for Barfoot, and Rob Morrow, an ex-Sims rider who is riding the very first board of his new company, Morrow Snowboards. This is when the Morrow Blaze came out. It was basically like a, it looked like a mini truck from Salem, Oregon. It had big flames on it. It was freaking awesome. Robbie Morrow is the shit, by the way, if you don't know. Not many companies made snowboards in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but as I learned, this was changing fast. This was just the beginning of an onslaught of new copycat companies, all vying for a piece of the snowboard industry pie. So here is a picture of me and Chris Swires with the late Tom Sims, and that's at the Vision Pro in the Snowpipe. We couldn't believe that we actually met Tom Sims that day, and that was taken by Trevor Graves. Pretty rad photo. I'm super glad that I have this photo because, you know, number one, Tom was like, you know, pretty incredible to meet and know Tom Sims, but even more incredible to, like, you know, just have a piece of history like this. And this was the day that I met him, and I was, you know, I rode for Sims at that point, and this is the freaking Tom Sims, the dude who, you know, skater and started Sims. Once we got used to the sheer size of the pipe, Swires and I started doing pretty well. After one run, I met Tom Sims, who not only founded Sims, but was also a photographer as well. I introduced myself, and despite his stoked demeanor, I was positive he had no idea who I was. He set up on one of the pipe's big frontside hits, where I pulled a big stiffy, shoved my board right in his face, and looked straight into the camera. I heard his camera go click, and Tom let out a loud and clear, "Yeah!" It was a verbal high five from the founder of Sims. 100% true. The Vision Sims Pro in the Snow contest got rolling on my fourth day in Tahoe. Lee Crane, the managing editor of Transworld Snowboarding magazine, was co-announcing the event with Wiley Asher, the senior editor of Transworld's competitor, International Snowboarding magazine. The two were calling out tricks, and their heckling of each other during of each other's magazines between runs grew more competitive as the contest went on. Wiley finally asked Lee something derogatory about his mother over the loudspeaker. And then Lee responded with, "My mother, why don't you ask her? She's right there." And Lee pointed out his mom, who had come to watch her son as he announced the event. Luckily, Lee's mom was laughing. I'm pretty sure that's a true story, Jim. Shortly thereafter, my run came up. It was a head-to-head format. I can't remember who I was up against, but it was somebody I was convinced was better than me, and I got the jitters. Halfway through, I fell when re-entering the half pipe off a pretty big method. I wanted to ride straight down the middle of the pipe and go hide, but something made me finish my run up. I grunted out a hand plant at the bottom and stalled it as long as I could. As I held it, I heard the crowd cheering, which gave me some redemption. And it wasn't like I had expected to beat any of these people anyway, at least not this time. As I was leaving, a guy wearing a Transworld snowboarding sweatshirt walked up to me and introduced himself. Formerly a sponsored East Coast skateboarder who I remember seeing in a 1985 Kryptonics ad, Fran Richards was now selling ads for Transworld skateboarding. "Hey Todd, I'd like you to have this," he said, and he threw me a Transworld sweatshirt. Then he handed me the February 1990 issue with a picture of John Boyer on the cover. Inside was an article called The Eastern Front, which had a photo from the open of me doing a double-handed hand plant at Stratton. The caption read, "Todd Richards has been turning heads on the New England Cup circuit for the past few years." The photo was taken by John Foster, who I vaguely remember meeting at the event. He was a guy with a big bushy beard and a bunch of cameras hanging around his neck. He looked like Chong from Cheech and Chong. Needless to say, I was happier than a pig in shit. The next 2 days, the slalom and Super G were held, and I figured if I didn't compete in them, Sims would probably drop me. Suffice to say, I was terrible. I get disqualified for missing some gates, and Chris Jameson won both events. And I will leave that off here for tonight, because the next part of this is gonna be, I will read this tomorrow, but there was it's a pretty legendary party that went down in Tahoe Donner that night, and yeah, I'll get into it. But all right, till tomorrow. I hope everyone's staying safe in quarantine, and yeah, I don't know what things are doing in your neck of the woods, but I know I have a bunch of friends that are kind of hiking Powell. A bunch of people in the backcountry still trying to film and, you know, maintain their safety, but just yesterday I heard that someone kicked off an avalanche in Colorado, and a ton of people had to come out from search and rescue and a bunch of volunteers to go and dig around in a snow pile to make sure no one was there. And that's the kind of shit that scares me, because you're needlessly exposing a whole bunch of people to whatever this fucking virus is, and we do not need that right now. We need all hands on deck at the hospitals, and everyone stay safe. We don't need to put each other in danger. So unless you know what the hell you're doing in the backcountry and you're out there with a partner that knows what the hell they're doing, just don't do it. It ain't worth it. See you guys tomorrow.